Hi, it's me again, it's Kenny. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today is the day we'll be preparing for videos and videos. Today is the day we've been waiting for to discuss on the visual pathway. And without wasting time, let's talk science. Um, so I've been asking this question for a little while. What's the difference between watch, see, and look? And I think you guys are now conversant with these terminologies. But this always brings the question: what sees between eyes and the brains? And what you're thinking about that? I think about that famous quote that says, "Your eyes cannot see what your brain doesn't know." Does it give you any clue about what sees between eyes and the brain? And while you're also thinking about that, think about when your eyes are closed. Can you see with your eyes closed? Can you see with your eyes closed? Think about sleeping. While you are asleep, you have dreams. Can you see in dreams? If yes, then your eyes are closed. Then what sees between eyes and your brain? And lastly, there is a supplemental question. We have these illusions and visual hallucinations. In illusions and visual hallucinations, your brain tries to interpret, to put something which is not there. We don't have something in. We have, for example, this material here is not a real material. My eyes cannot see this, but my brain puts it in the environment. And in visual illusions and hallucinations, people other people cannot see what you're seeing, so it's like basically your brain tries to put something in environment. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to my YouTube channel, and today we are discussing about the visual pathway. I am so excited to have this discussion today, and without wasting time, let's do this. Oh, yeah, so the visual pathway is the topic of discussion today. I am super excited because at the end of this video, you guys will be marvelous in, visual pathway. Every one of you will be like expert in visual pathway. All right, so let's begin. The visual pathway is just a path that is taken by a visual information to travel from a space all the way to the visual cortex. So any journey, any station in between contributes to what is called the visual pathway. So it's just a journey. You're moving from the visual space all the way to the occipital cortex or occipital lobe or the visual cortex. That is what is known as a visual pathway. That the visual pathway, that journey is taken all the way to the occipital lobe. So let's take a journey. Let's take a tour on this visual pathway. So let's take a tour on the visual pathway. So visual pathway starts from the retina. Remember when we were discussing about retina? Oh guys, please, if you haven't watched the previous videos, it makes no sense for you to watch this video because almost like 90% of the concepts you are using here, they are coming from the previous video. So please take your time to go and watch before you come and watch this video. It's always here in YouTube and you can watch at any time you want. So the visual pathway started from the retina, and remember I told you the retina is like extension of the brain. You cannot forget that it's like extension of the brain. So the visual pathway starts from the retina, and the retina is, we divided the retina in the previous video into two halves, literally two halves, in the nasal half and temporal half. So this is the nasal half and temporal half, the nasal half and temporal half, and then the visual, the retina, right? The retinoid ganglion, retinal ganglion fibers get together to form the optic nerve, and then it exits through the optic. It forms the optic nerve, and then it exits from optic canal, through the optic canal to leave the globe, or yes, to leave the socket, and then it comes to form the optic nerve, and then from optic nerve we have the so-called optic chiasm, which is really the exchange of fibers or a crossing over of fibers, and then from optic chiasm we have optic tract, and from optic tract the information goes to the lateral geniculate nucleus or the lateral geniculate body, and then from there the information goes to the visual cortex by the way of optic radiations. So that's just simply a tour the information comes all the way from the eyes to the visual cortex to the occipital lobe. That is the visual cortex. Well, we define now we divided the retina into two halves, the nasal half and the temporal half, the nasal half and the temporal halves, and the information from temporal halves and the nasal half, they all get together to form the optic nerve, the retinal ganglion fibers. As I've told you, the retinal ganglion says they get together to form an optic nerve. And then optic nerve has got two kind of fibers. It has the temporal fibers and the nasal fiber. Temporal fibers and the nasal fibers. And at the optic chiasm, it's only the nasal fibers that cross over. So the nasal fiber from this eye, this one, and the nasal fiber from this eye are the one that cross over at the optic chiasm. The optic chiasm have crossing over of nasal fiber from either eye, Okay, so that means in the optic tract, is made up of two kind of fibers. If you pay close attention, you will see that this optic tract, for example, is made up of the temporal fibers from this eye, and the nasal fiber from this eye, So the optic chiasm is made up of the ipsilateral temporal fibers and the contralateral nasal fibers. Ipsilateral temporal fibers and the contralateral ipsilateral temporal fibers, yes, and contralateral nasal fibers. So each optic tract is made up of these two kind of fibers, the ipsilateral temporal and the contralateral nasal fibers. And then after we having this optic chiasm, well, from the optic tract all the way to the visual cortex, this information is maintained. Like in all of these structures, all of this pathway, we carry the ipsilateral temporal and the contralateral nasal. So from here all the way to the cerebral cortex, to the visual cortex, we have the ipsilateral temporal and the contralateral nasal fibers. Nasal fibers all the way to the the lateral geniculate, the optic radiations, and the atmetry to the visual cortex. We maintain these we are maintaining that discrimination, ipsilateral and contralateral, ipsilateral temporal and the contralateral nasal fibers. So let's put something together here. Let's put the visual pathway together with the visual field, together with the visual field. And what we said in the previous video is, the temporal retina observes the nasal visual space, and the nasal retina observes the temporal visual space. Same applies here. The temporal retina observes the nasal visual space, and the nasal retina observes the temporal visual space. What does it mean? It means at the optic tract, remember the optic tract is made up by ipsilateral temporal and the contralateral nasal fibers. So it means this optic tract of the left side takes information from the nasal visual field of the left eye and the temporal visual field of the right eye. The optic tract of the left eye takes information from the nasal visual field of the left eye and the temporal visual field of the right eye. Are we together? Yeah, so that also means that information from the optic tract all the way to the cerebral cortex, to the visual cortex, all the way to the visual cortex, where the visual cortex of the left side observes the right side of this image and the right side of this field and the right side of this field. So it takes information from the ipsilateral nasal visual field and the contralateral temporal of visual space, temporal visual space. Does it make sense? And also, the optic tract, from optic tract of the right side, because we said it contains the ipsilateral, temporal, and the contralateral nasal. And so this, the right side, the optic, from optic tract all the way to the visual cortex, they observe the left side of this visual space and the left side of this visual space. So it's observed the ipsilateral nasal space and the contralateral temporal space and the contralateral temporal space. So that's the visual it's just a visual fade. So in summary, you can just say the right from the right optic tract all the way to the visual cortex, from the right optic tract all the way to the visual cortex. They observe the right side, observe the left side of the image, the left side of the visual space, the left side of the visual space. So the left side of this eye, which is temporal, and the left side of this one is nasal. The same applies here. From optic tract all the way to the visual cortex, they take information from the nasal, from the right side of this visual space and the right side of this visual space. So the nasal, ipsilateral nasal, and contralateral temporal fibers. You can pause this video for as long as you want to grab this concept and then make sure you have understood before you made a move. All right, so the visual pathway, as I told you, right, today we are just talking about the visual path, just taking this journey all the way from the retina to the cerebral, to the visual cortex, The retina, we discussed about the retina in the previous 2 or 3 videos. You take your time to watch, and we won't talk about retina today. And I have a separate video that I will discuss about the optic nerve, and the optic nerve will not be discussed today. So today we are starting discussing from the optic chiasm all the way to the cerebral, to the visual cortex, from optic chiasm all the way to the visual cortex. So let's continue with our journey. Now we are going to discuss about the optic chiasm. The optic nerve is not discussed today. We'll have a separate discussion, and the retina is already discussed. And then now let's discuss about the optic chiasm. So the optic chiasm, as I've told you, is just crossing of fibers, but not all fibers. Just the nasal fibers from either eye will cross at the optic chiasm to go and form an optic tract. So the optic nerve gives some nasal fibers from left eye and the nasal fiber from right eye, which cross at the retina, at the optic chiasm, and then they form the optic tract. The optic tract. So today I want you to appreciate the association or the relationship between the optic tract, the optic chiasm, and this little stuff here, which is the pituitary gland. So this is also an optic tract here. It's an optic tract that passes just below the pituitary gland, just above the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is a little bit below, just below the optic chiasm. And so this is pituitary stalk that it hangs, hangs the pituitary gland. It put that in why it stays in the hypophyseal folds of the sella tussica, the Turkish saddle. And now, so this is optic chiasm. So what happens if now you see, you have this close proximity between the optic chiasm and the pituitary gland, and also we have internal carotid arteries. So the left internal carotid artery and the right internal carotid artery, they are also in close proximity to the optic chiasm. So number one, what happens if we have something like enlargement of the pituitary gland? So the pituitary gland enlarges, like in a pituitary tumor, for example. So this will This will result into compression of the optic chiasm by the pituitary gland. Assuming you are compressing the central part of the optic chiasm, what happens where we say that central part of the optic chiasm is the nasal fiber from either nasal fiber from either visual space, and then this is what happens. The nasal, we are compressing, we have a pituitary tumor or enlargement of pituitary gland that compresses the central part of the optic chiasm, and the central part of the optic chiasm contains the nasal fibers from either eye, and the nasal fiber from either eye, they take the information from temporal sides of the visual space. So this one is observing this temporal side, and this one is observing this temporal side. So what happens if you have compression at the optic chiasm is compression of these nasal fibers, and then these nasal fiber, they take information from the temporal sides, and so we will lose vision on the temporal sides of the visual space. So this is how a person with compression at the optic chiasm sees the environment, sees the visual space, and sees the world. So the temporal half are gone, the temporal halves of the visual space are gone, so you cannot see on the temporal half of the visual space, but the nasal half remained intact. I think you now know why we lose, because couldn't emphasize more. And then, as I've told you, we have this relationship between the optic chiasm and the internal carotid arteries. And let's take a look. So a person like you and I, we're just having normal perfect vision. We're looking, this is how we see the world, but something strange can happen. You see this internal carotid arteries on either side of the optic chiasm. So we have that close proximity, and if we put this one into this one is the coronal section. If we take this one and put here, it means the internal carotid artery sits somewhere around here, and another one sits around here. Well, so they sit on the sides, on either sides of the optic chiasm. So assuming I have something like enlargement or something like aneurysm of the internal carotid, well, it's gonna compress this part of the optic chiasm, either this or this one, depending on which side is affected. So depending on which side is affected. So if we have compression by the internal carotid, means we are compressing the temporal halves of the retina, the temporal fibers, and the temporal fiber, they take information from the nasal visual space, and the temporal fibers also take information from nasal visual. So assuming you're having, that's what I was talking about, right? The temporal fiber here, they take information from the nasal visual space, and then the temporal fibers also, they take information from the nasal visual space. So assuming I'm having bilateral compressions of the by the internal carotid arteries on either side, what vision will I have? I will have the vision that I will lose the the medial halves of either eye, the nasal halves of either eye, because I have compression of the temporal fibers on either eyes. But not all the time. That was case of bilateral compression, the compression from either sides by the internal carotid arteries. But not all the time we will have bilateral compression. We can have the unilateral compression. So assuming you have in a unilateral compression, for example, on only the left eye, means the left eye is compressed by the internal carotid artery, so the temporal fibers of the left eye are compressed. And you remember, the temporal fibers, they take information from the nasal visual space of the left eye. So I will have the perfect vision by the right eye here, the perfect vision. This is how the right eye sees this perfect. And then on the left side, I will have loss of vision on the nasal half of the left eye. So in case of unilateral compression of the optic chiasm, so you have to retain this knowledge of the relationship between the optic chiasm and the pituitary gland, as well as the internal carotid arteries. So let's continue with our tour. Right, we are moving along the visual pathway. So we have something that we call geniculate and the extrageniculate here. So we have pathways, like there are two different pathways. The geniculate pathway, it usually means the information from the optic tract, or the optic tract go to the lateral geniculate nucleus, or the lateral geniculate body, which is just around which is found in the thalamus. We talked about it. We talk about it some other time later. And then we have some other fibers that will not go through the lateral geniculate nucleus. They will deviate, like bypass the lateral geniculate nucleus to get into some other centers, like the pretectal nucleus and the superior colliculus. So we have some fibers that will never go to the lateral geniculate nucleus, and this fiber we call them the extrageniculate, because they don't go to the geniculate nucleus. So they are extrageniculate because they don't show themselves up in the lateral geniculate nucleus. So they in summary, they take another like another route to go to some other nuclei. So the pretectal nucleus and the superior colliculus, they are all found in the midbrain. So they are part of the brainstem. So they are not found in the in the cerebral cortex, or they're not found in the forebrain. They are found in the brainstem, and we see what they do. So the optic tract, they kind of wraps around the midbrain to go and meet the lateral geniculate nucleus. Okay, let's continue with our journey. Yeah, so this is what I was saying, like the information from the optic tract, they have like a lot of alternatives. They can go through a lot of stations. Some fibers from the optic chiasm will go to the hypothalamus somewhere. This, you cannot see the hypothalamus from this point, but we have this suprachiasmatic nucleus. The chiasm, suprachiasmatic. Supra means above, chiasmatic means the optic chiasm. So they are just above the optic chiasm, and they are associated with controlling the circadian cycle, the sleep awake cycle. We have a separate discussion on this, and then that's controlled. We discuss about it sometimes, whether it's like an internal clock. And then some of the fibers, as we've said, they go through the pretectal nucleus, and then the pretectal nucleus is the very, very important nucleus in pupillary light reaction, in control of size of our pupils. It's very, very important, and we have a discussion shortly, about on the pupillary light reaction or pupillary light reflex. And then some of the fibers we've seen, they go through the superior colliculus. They deviate from the extrageniculate pathway to go to the superior colliculus, and then the superior colliculus is important in eye movements of the eyes, and some other visual attention. We have also a separate discussion about that. And then lastly, the information go through the lateral geniculate nucleus, and the lateral geniculate nucleus is important in some other body behavioral functioning. So that's the summary of the options of the termination of the optic tract. So the optic tract can terminate any of those centers, above. So we have seen already, we are not discussing about the lateral geniculate nucleus, but I will show you the layers of the lateral geniculate nucleus. But we have already seen the optic chiasm, the optic tract, and now we are going to see the layers of the lateral geniculate nucleus. So we are moving at a very good pace. Alright, so the lateral geniculate nucleus, the lateral geniculate body of the lateral geniculate nucleus is we're not talking in details about the lateral geniculate nucleus, but the lateral geniculate nucleus has got 6 layers, layer number 1 to number 6, and why is it important is because someone is asking himself or herself that, okay, so we have said the information that they are coming from optic tract. They have the ipsilateral temporal fibers and the contralateral nasal fibers. Then are these fibers mixed? Are these fibers mixed, or they are just discriminated? Are they discriminated, or they are mixed together? Then the answer to it, the fibers are discriminated. They identify themselves like, oh well, this we are coming from the temporal half, we are coming from the ipsilateral temporal, and then the other fibers, they say, oh, we are coming from the contralateral nasal retina. So we maintain this discrimination, and they terminate in different levels, the different layers of the lateral geniculate nucleus. So example, here you can see we have the first layer is the contralateral nasal fiber with synapsia, and then the ipsilateral temporal with synapsia, and then it goes in that order. But seriously, it's not something that you should put into immediate attention. That's just something, if someone was curious to know whether these fibers are mixed, or they have like with separation. All right, and then how we go to we have seen the lateral geniculate nucleus, and then we have said from the lateral geniculate nucleus, somewhere around here, the information goes to the visual cortex, by the way of optic radiations, and the visual cortex is made up of two. It's found in the calcareous fissure, and then we have the upper bank of calcareous fissure and the lower bank of calcareous fissure. We have the upper bank of the calcareous fissure and the lower bank of calcareous fissure. So the information goes from the lateral geniculate nucleus to the optic, to the visual cortex by the way of optic radiation. This is optic radiation I was talking about, and then the optic radiation is divided, like we have like two parts. It has the superior part, or the upper part of the optic upper part of the optic radiation, and the lower part of the optic radiation, but all terminate along the banks of the calcareous fissure, So we see that we have some fibers that take sweep around, and then they go to sweep around, and then they go back to the visual cortex. So we have fibers that they loop around the lateral horn, or the temporal horn of the lateral ventricle, and you know that the temporal horn of the lateral ventricle is found in the temporal lobe. So we have some fibers that are taking their tour through the temporal lobe, and then we have some fibers that take their tour through the parietal lobe. So we have this is going through above, and then this is going through below. So and then these fibers that are the lower optic tract, the lower optic fibers, we call them the Meyer's lobe. So they take this journey in the inferior the lateral horn of the lateral ventricle, or the temporal horn of the lateral ventricle. I'll tell you something. This is inferior. The inferior Meyer's lobe, the inferior optic radiation, it projects into the inferior bank of the calcareous fissure. So the inferior optic radiation projects the inferior bank of the calcareous fissure. The inferior part of the optic radiation projects the inferior bank of the calcareous fissure. Same applies, the upper part of the optic radiation projects to the upper part of the calcareous fissure, the upper bank of the calcareous fissure. So the inferior for inferior, and upper for upper, superior for superior. I give you something also very easy to grasp at this point. I give something very easy to grasp at this point. The inferior the inferior optic radiations take information from the inferior retina, the inferior part of the retina. So the inferior part of the optic radiations, they receive information from inferior part of the retina. So inferior for inferior for inferior. So inferior retina, inferior optic radiation, inferior bank of the cortical effusion. And then superior for superior for superior. Superior part of the retina for the superior part or the upper part of the optic radiation for the upper bank or superior bank of the cortical effusion. I will emphasize this maybe as we are moving, but that was just a summary. And then, what is optic radiation really? We have already seen that optic radiation is the way that information coming from the retinotopic nucleus to go all the way to the visual cortex, And what do we know about the visual cortex? What do we know about the optic radiation? Well, we already said that the optic radiation, they contain the ipsilateral temporal fibers and the contralateral the nasal fibers. The ipsilateral temporal fibers, the contralateral nasal fibers. So this is how they see this is what they observe in the visual space. So these optic fibers, the optic radiation, for example, of the left eye, observe the ipsilateral nasal visual field and the contralateral temporal visual space. So ipsilateral nasal space and the contralateral temporal space. We have already talked about this one, but I want you to add a terminology here. Right? If we have the same side of a visual space affected, for example, we have the right side of this visual field affected and the right side of this visual field affected. Right? We have the right side of the left eye and the right side of the right eye affected. We have a terminology for them. We call that contralateral homonymous visual field. Contralateral we call them homonymous because it is the right side of this one and the right side of this one. So homonymous means the same. And then we have this the contralateral means like one is found in this eye and the other one is found in the other eye, on the other visual space. So these two fields here, we call them the contralateral, the right, because they're on the right side, the right contralateral homonymous visual field, or we call the contralateral right homonymous visual field. They all have implication when it comes into visual field defects, as we discuss about them. So something to notice about the optic radiations, we've already seen that they take the information from the contralateral homonymous visual fields. So if I have damage of all of the optic radiations, I will lose information. Optic radiation on this side, for example, I will lose information from this nasal space and this temporal space. But I'll tell you what, because we've already seen that the optic radiation is also divided into two. We have the upper or optic radiation, then the lower optic radiation. We have the superior part of the optic radiation and the inferior part of the optic radiation. What did we say about them? Well, then, before I emphasize this, because we have upper bank and lower bank, we can sometimes have isolated damage on the inferior bank only, on the inferior part only, or we can also have damage only on the upper part of the optic radiation. They all have different implications, and as I've told you, the inferior part of the optic radiation takes information from the inferior part of the retina, the lower retina. So they take information from the lower retina, and then the upper part of the optic radiation takes information from the upper part of the retina. But we know what it means by saying the upper retina, because the upper part of the retina observes the lower visual space and the lower part of the retina observes the upper visual space. What does it mean? Cosa significa? It means if I have damage on the lower part of the optic tract, the optic radiation, I will have affected the lower part of the retina, which means I will lose information from the upper part of the visual space, But which side is affected? What do you think? Pause this video and think about which side will be affected. If I have damage on the left Meyer's loop, the left inferior part of the optic radiation. Yes, I know it's upper part of the visual space, but on which side and what part of the visual field will be affected? Write me in the comment before I tell you so soon. Think about it, think about it, and pause this video and think about that one. Well, now I'm telling you, like so if I have damage on the left side of the Meyer's loop, the left side of the optic tract, and then the lefty lower optic radiation. So the left side, but lower part. Well, we know that if we have damage on left side, we have affected the nasal, the right contralateral homonymous visual field will be affected. The right contralateral. See here. Like if you affect the left side, the right nasal, and the right side of this image of this eye, and the right side of this visual space, and the right side of this visual space will be affected. So we have a half affected and the half affected. Yeah, and then, but we know that not all of the optic radiations are damaged. Only the inferior part of the optic radiations are damaged, which means I will lose the information from the upper quadrant of this right side and the upper quadrant of this side. I think it makes sense. It makes sense because I lose the information from the upper visual space, but not all of the upper, but only the upper right contralateral homonymous visual space. Well, you can pause and how you want, and then you think about them. So if I also have damage at the inferior part of the optic radiation, the superior part of the optic radiation, I will have affected the upper part of the retina, and the upper part of the retina takes information from the lower visual space. Not all the lower visual space, of course, but not all of the lower visual space will be affected by the optic radiations, where we will have the contralateral. For example, if we are talking about the left side, the left optic tract, where we have the right contralateral inferior quadrant will be affected, because we know that this has the nasal. It takes, this one observes the nasal visual space of the ipsilateral nasal and the contralateral temporal, but not all of them. Just if we are talking about the upper part, then the lower part of the visual space, the lower part will be affected. So the ipsilateral right lower quadrant, ipsilateral nasal lower quadrant, and then the contralateral temporal lower part will be affected. We see how we discuss on those. How we discuss about those scenarios on visual field defects. And then we know that human beings are highly visual creatures. They are highly visual creatures in a sense that we depend on visual cues to survive. We do a lot of, all of our activities that we are doing nowadays. All the activities that we are doing, we depend. Most 90% maybe of the activities that we are doing, we depend on sight to complete our activities. But that's how we were made to survive in the kingdom Animalia, because we were depending on sight, looking for foods, finding for shelter, looking for mates. And so basically a lot of what we are doing is contributed by the sight of vision. So assuming that all of these activities, this is just a summary, but you just think of anything you're doing that you require the vision, that you require the sense of vision, and think about anything really that you're doing that requires the sense of vision. In other words, assume one day, tomorrow, you wake up blind. By how much percent you think your activities will be affected? How about your quality of life? Will you do what you're doing today? So like today you are doing whatever you're doing. I think you are depending on the vision, and assume tomorrow you wake up blind completely. What you see in the morning is total darkness. You can't see anything, like your eyes are broken forever. How much do you think your life will be destroyed, and would you be able to survive alone without like being taken care of? So it's difficult, and this is how we were made to survive in the kingdom and Maria. Imagine if at all what evolution tells us is true, like we came from animals and we were living in jungles, we were like living with all these dangerous animal. How would you be able to know that this is, that is lion coming, I have to take this action, and that? How would you know it's a lion? It's not the goat, for example. It's not the sheep, or it's not something like which is not dangerous. How would you know? Because myself, I don't know even how the lion smells. I don't know how even a dog smells. I don't know like the smell of a dog. So I rely on my sight to look for dangerous animals, like to be aware of the environment you are. So that's another way we are made to survive in kingdom animalia, in the animal kingdom, because we have a lot of diversity of organisms. Some are dangerous, and how do you know that's a snake? You cannot even smell. You don't know how they smell, how the snake smells, for example. Yeah, so we depend in survival in kingdom animalia. We depend much on vision, which is contrast. For example, in animals like dog, the dog depends on the sense of smell, the olfactory information to survive in the kingdom animalia. It interacts with the world using much at a greater percent using the smell. And the science says that a dog has like 10,000 times higher sensitivity to smell than humans. We human, the dog has got 10,000. Think about 10,000 times higher sensitivity in smell than we humans. So you see how poor we are in smelling. We are very poor, but we have we interact with the environment environment using our eyes at a greater percent, and so that the brain knows that the brain is so clever to understand that this person relies much on the on vision. So it also knows how much it benefits from vision. So how much information it gets from the visual space, from the vision, from any activities or that associated with light. So having known, so it has devoted a bigger part of it. A bigger part of the brain is devoted to deal with visual information. A bigger part of the brain is devoted to deal with visual information than any other information. So we rely a little bit on smell, but at a bigger percent, we don't even care about the sound. At the bigger percent, the brain has devoted itself to deal with the visual information. So we have all those centers that go to the protector nucleus, goes to the superior cortical. So some go to the hypothalamus, some go to the visual cortex. All these areas are devoted because of how important the vision is to us. So a bigger part of the brain is devoted to deal with visual information. Yeah, so the visual cortex or the so-called the visual cortex lies in the occipital lobe. It's an occipital lobe, so all of the occipital lobe is devoted for vision. And you can see, for example, the temporal lobe is meant to deal with auditory stuff, but still we have some visual processing centers in the temporal. So you see, literally it's all over. And then the primary visual area lies in the calcaline, in the banks of calcaline fissure, and it lies in the banks of calcaline fissure. We have the superior bank or the upper bank of calcaline fissure and the lower bank of the calcaline fissure. So that's the area number 17. Brodmann area number 17, but we know that we have also the primary the Brodmann area number 18 and 19, which are the prime visual association area, and the secondary visual area. We already said the Meyer's group, the lower optic tract projects to the lower retina, to the lower they project into the lower bank of the calcarine fissure, and the upper part of the optic radiation projecting to the superior bank of the optic of the visual cortex. So let's talk about something that is known as retinotopic organization. Just like how we heard those homunculus, the sensory and the somatosensory and motor homunculus. Well, the occipital lobe is also divided in the occipital lobe is also organized in a sense that it observes the visual space. So look, for example, here, this is the visual space of the left eye, the left visual space, and then this is the right visual space. Same applies. That's what we have been seeing in the previous examples. Then we have divided, for the matter of convenience, we have divided in these the visual cortex into 3 parts. So we have the most posterior part here, which we're given it number one, and we have the middle part, which is number 2, and the anterior part, which is number 3. And please note, these are not Brodmann areas. These are not numbers, Brodmann number. We would even put something like letters here. Maybe we could say this is A, this is B, and this is C. So it's not something special. So don't you try to think they are Brodmann areas, that 3, 1, and 2. No, not at all. They are not 3, 1, and 2. They are just representation of these spaces. Okay? They are just representation of these spaces. So retinotopic organization is how the visual space is mapped into the retina. The visual space is mapped into the occipital lobe. The visual space, how the visual space is mapped into the it's like a map of the visual space. So this means that this most posterior part, which is area number 1, it represents the most central part of the visual space. So this is number 1. You see, this is number 1. So this number 1 here in the occipital lobe represents the most central part of the visual field, of the visual space. And then as we are moving forward, this number 2 here represents this region here, this region over here, and then number 3 is mapped, more lateral part, the most lateral part of the visual space. So we've seen it's concentric. It's like it is put in cycles, and the most posterior part represents the most central part. And then this most central part, it coincides with the macula. Remember what we say, like when you're looking forward, the visual axis goes all the way to the macula, the fovea centralis. So this most central part of the visual space, all the light goes to the central retina. And then so the most posterior part of the visual cortex represent the information from the most central part of the visual space, which goes to the macula. So this most central part, it represents the macula. So macula on this side and macula on this side. But as I've told you, as we are moving from the optic tract all the way to the cerebral cortex, all the way to the visual cortex, the information, we have the ipsilateral temporal fibers and the contralateral nasal fibers. But the ipsilateral temporal fiber take the information. For example, this is the right cerebral cortex. This is the right cerebral hemisphere. And then if it's the right cerebral hemisphere, we know in the right side it carries the ipsilateral temporal, the temporal from the right side, and the temporal from the right side takes information from the nasal visual space. So this temporal side observe this nasal visual space, And then we know this also, the right cerebral hemisphere, the right cortex, also takes information from the contralateral nasal retina, and the contralateral nasal retina takes information from the this temporal space. I think now you are conversant. So that what I wanted to emphasize here is when I have damage at this cerebral cortex, at this visual cortex, if it's right side, where the part that will be affected is ipsilateral nasal space and the contralateral temporal space. But maybe I have only damage to the upper bank. Maybe you see now this blue color. The blue color is upper bank, the upper bank of carotid fissure. And what did we say about the upper bank? The upper bank, it takes information from the upper part of the retina, and the upper part of the retina observes the lower visual space. So if I have damage on this bluish part here, well, I will have damage on the lower quadrant of the visual space, and not all of it will be affected. And then if I have specifically damaged the part number 1 here, well, the part that will be affected is the upper bank. You see this bluish is upper bank, but not but it's the upper bank, which the upper bank observes the lower visual space, but not all of the lower visual space will be affected. It will be affected only number 1. And why is number 1? Number 1 is this central part here. So I will have only damage at this point. If I will have lost the number 1 vision here. Not all of it, not all of the lower quadrant will be affected. Only number 1 will be affected, which number 1 is here. And then assuming now I have damaged these two numbers here, number 3 and number 2, and then number 1 is spared as no damage. Well, remember, this is the upper bank, which translates into lower space, lower quadrant, the lower quarter for it. And then I have damaged this 1 and 2, 2 and 3, and have spared this one. So I will have like this region of no vision, but at this center I will have spared the vision at the very central part of it. Does it make sense? I'm using much time here because we can have a lot of questions that come in from this part here. And then also, now this reddish stuff here, I think I'm refining it as to red. It might not necessarily be red, but the red part here is lower bank of carotid fissure. The lower bank of carotid fissure takes information from the upper parts, the upper quadrant. But we have numbered the most central part, the most posterior part represent the most central part. So if it's upper, you see this red where the red is, and then I have the number 1 affected, which is most posterior, which is represent the most central part here. So the most central part will be affected. If I have damage at number 2, this is a concentric, it's like a cycle. So it depends. If it's just a quadrant, if it's just a lower bank, I will have only this quadrant. The concentric part of this quadrant will be affected. We will see as we are moving. And then we have this now, what we call the macular sparing lesions. The macular sparing lesion. Now, take example of these 2 pictures here. Take example of these 2 pictures. Okay. Yeah. Now, this picture, for example, we know that it's a quadrant. So these are the quadrant that are affected. The quadrant, and to be specific, is the left upper quadrants of either eyes. So of the either visual space. So the left upper quadrant of this one and the left upper quadrant of this. This means the part of the brain that is affected at first place is the right side of the brain. Okay, is the right side of the brain. I'm trying now to solve this question, right side of the brain. Also for this picture also, because the left part is affected, the left part of the visual space is affected, which means they will have affected the left contralateral homonymous visual spaces, means the right part of the brain is affected. All the way, the problem can be all the way from the optic tract to the visual cortex. It depends, as I've told you, because from the visual space, from the optic tract all the way backward, we all the way to the visual space, we maintain this discrimination. And then now I know that the left part is affected, the right part of the brain is affected, but which part is specifically affected? For example, in these two pictures here, both the upper and lower quadrants are affected. Both the upper and lower quadrant are affected. So, and I'm taking you back to the cerebral to the visual cortex. You know, if I have upper and lower quadrants affected, which means I have upper and lower banks of calcar and fissure affected on the right side of the brain. Are we together on the right side of the visual space of the visual cortex? Are we together, guys? Are we together? If you're not together, you like pause the video and go a little bit back to think and to try to connect. And then I know that the right side is affected, but which right side specifically? Both upper and lower banks of the calcar and fissure is affected. But you see, I can still maintain to say the central part of the vision, the central part of the field are spared. The central part of the field are spared. What does it mean? What does the central part? Where does the central part project? The central part projects to the most posterior part, which was number 1 here. Remember, the central part here was number 1, so it was number 1. So what does it mean? I have all the damage. I have all the loss from the, this lateral side. I mean, yes, the outermost shell of the visual space, but I have spared the central part, so the central part is spared. So I have damaged all these two parts, but I have spared this part. So this is what we call the macular sparing lesion. The macular sparing lesion. They have spared the macular portion of the visual space. The macular portion of the visual space. And then let's think about this another example here. Let's think about this another example here. So we know, like, okay, so the side affected, number 1, the side affected is the left side of the visual space, which means the side affected is the right side of the brain. The right side of the brain is affected, and then not all of the left side is affected. Not all of it. It's just the upper part. The upper part is affected, which translates into lower banks or the lower parts of the visual system. So all the way from optic radiations to the cerebral, to the visual cortex, the lower bank, the lower parts of the optic radiations, or the lower part of the visual cortex is affected. And then we see not all the quadrant is affected. Not all the quadrant is affected. The most central part of the quadrant, is spared. Is spared. What does it mean? It means it has spared the most posterior portion of the visual cortex. The most posterior portion of the visual cortex. So that's how we try to think about when we are dealing with the visual field defects. So we bear in mind all these possibilities. All right, I think that was it from today's discussion, and I got some scientific facts. For you. Do you know, like, the brain favors the information, the visual input from one eye as compared to the other? Do you know that the brain favors the visual input from one eye than the other? It's like the brain has got this preference. It prefers the information from right side, for example, of the left side, the left eye, more than the other. It's kind of like it trusts one eye more than the other, and this is what we call the ocular dominance. Just like how we had dominant hands, like someone is right-handed, and someone is left-handed. The brain has also got some dominancy when it comes to the eyes. So it prefers information from one eye as compared to the other eye. And can you see with the eyes closed, as I've told you? Yes. And what do you see in dreams? What do you see? Well, in dreams, what we see, it's like the brain creates like a cinema. So it creates like a cinema based on what? Based on memories, fantasies imaginations of what you're thinking about, emotions, experience, all of these, they combine together to form a dream. And I will have another a separate discussion of the dream, because the dream has a lot of facts that we cannot left them unsaid. So we'll have a discussion sometimes later on dream. Do you know when a baby do you know like when a baby is born, and do you know when a newborn is put the newborn is put into is lies in darkness? It's not just the eyes that can go blind. The brain can also forget to see. The brain can forget how to see. When a newborn is baby when a baby is born, and then it's lies in a dark environment for a little amount of time, and the eyes can go blind. But not only the eyes, the brain can also forget to see, and that's what we call the deprivation amblyopia. During development of the visual system, we depend on light to develop our visual pathway. The visual pathway is activated by light. So is it very, very important to put babies, like to expose them in light? Not necessarily sunlight in terms of vision. We can just or any other kind of light can activate the visual information. Also, like if we have something like a cataract, something that obstruct the light rays to go through the eye. For example, have the structural defect, for example, a cataract, mtoto wa jicho, for example. Why is it important to treat that in mtoto wa jicho? Why is it important to treat the cataract? It is important because if you don't treat, if the brain gets the poor quality of image from an eye, for example, from my right eye, if it gets a poor kind of vision, and a poor visual acuity, it progressively shuts down that eye. So it like kind of kills it naturally. It forgets about it. It says, "Oh, you are not important. You're not important to me anymore. So I don't need you." So it shuts down progressively the information from that eye, to the extent that it like becomes totally blind. Even though you can correct this deformity, you can like treat this cataract, and if you treat it very late, that the brain has already forgotten about it, and then it has no use, because the brain has already shut down all the information that comes from that eye. So even if you have it perfect, you have corrected it perfectly, but if you delay to correct that, the brain can shut down, and that's what we call the deprivation amblyopia. So think about it, and let your babies let them be exposed to light. And then I know everyone exposed. I know everyone exposed their babies into light, but I just want to give you like a fact. It's like a fact. And also those people who have cataract, they think whether or not is okay to get them treated. Yes, I'm telling you, it's very, very important to get them treated, because the longer the brain waits to see from that eye, the longer it takes to see, the longer you will have to restore this function back, because it progressively shuts down the information, it shuts down the system from that eye. So that was it from today's discussion. I think today's discussion has added a lot to the bank of your knowledge, to the foundation, the fund of your knowledge. And stay tuned. We soon going to discuss about the visual field defects. Now we haven't seen anything like a visual field defects, and stay tuned, as soon we're going to discuss about them. Ciao.